During my trip to Spain in May 2016, I saw really lots of types of ruins. First of all, some of those that I'm calling Dirankuyu style, named after the famous underground city in Turkey. Then I also saw so-called elf castles. Learned a lot about the so-called rivers of stone that I've been noticing all over the world, and there was yet another new category, the Cristobal style category. Let's start with the Bobastro ruins. You will notice remains of primitive stone walls on the right side. Very detailed information is given about them to the tourists who visit, and so those tourists remain with the impression that this is some sort of 1 or 2,000 years old historic site, helped also by the boards that are found all over the place. They describe rulers of early Christianity and medieval times. And so the tourists naively believe that that is all that there is to it because of their faith in the professional historians. But those so-called historians keep total silence about the older rock-cut stuff. This clearly belongs to an entirely different era. Look at the erosion. Corners of what is left are very much smoothened, and the pieces that are missing are either ground up or are not found anywhere around. If the medieval walls were exposed to that much of erosion, they would have been missing completely long time ago. Actually, this is the best preserved part. Mostly it is so eroded that one cannot even understand what was it. One is lucky to see even two corners of a room still left together. Usually it's only one. The rest of it being completely devoured by time. For example, look at these remains of something. The one on the right is relatively well preserved. One would surely say, yes, this was rock cut, it was something at one point. Well, the other ones on the left, they are so eroded that taken separately, one would even wonder, is this a natural formation or a ruin?
Here's a close-up of the somewhat better preserved one. And then this on the left. It could have been like this as well, but has simply disappeared over time. And who knows how many stories it was originally. Can't even say for sure if everything is fully excavated or if some parts are still filled in. And here you can see very well again the contrast between the much newer stuff on the left side and the older one on the right.
And if one takes a walk in the woods around, it becomes absolutely clear that this is a very small portion. Actually, this was a very big town, if not a huge metropolis. Remains of rooms and chambers of all kinds of shape and size could be seen on and on for kilometers. Although most of them were already in such a poor shape that taken separately could be reviewed as geological formation as well, still, at many places the remains of right corners and arches could be still spotted in the woods. There was one also pretty long wall. It didn't come out well on this photograph, but on the spot there was no doubt that this is a dressed surface. At places, very deep and narrow cuttings were still visible on the stone. And as I said, the full thing was just massive. The city, one would need months to even see all of it once, what to speak of properly researching it. But as we traveled with the car in the very far distance, maybe there were other places where the internal architectural elements were still showing a little bit. Actually, Bobastro is absolutely unique and amazing because it gives us probably a glimpse of a bit of the internal elements of design used in extreme antiquity. These very same oval elements are seen in the Turkish parts of this same network of cities that spreads over many continents. But in Turkey, it is often hard to say did that oval design belong to the original dwellings or it was part of the additions that were made by numerous cultures afterwards. And people on all continents found and reused the remains of these old cities. For example, India is famous for its absolutely marvelous carved caves. Very few researchers pay attention to the fact that most of them are carved on the top of the ruins of such heavily eroded underground cities. It is kind of easy to dismiss it because it is so eroded. People are immediately attracted to the better preserved and beautifully carved stuff on the top. Even as far as America, we seem to have outposts of this civilization that was digging out these cities. This is just one of the examples, but as usual, they are not given enough attention. These are some more recent examples of this type of architectural design, just to give us an illustration of how it might have looked like when people were using the underground cities. But let's get back to the forest at Bobastro. As I was walking around, all of a sudden I saw what I have been mentioning very often in my videos, a river of stones. And then it all became crystal clear to me, all this mystery about the rivers of stones and why always around them some strange historic discrepancies, so-called mysteries, are found. It is because these rivers, they are telling us that the glaciers were dragging stones and selectively placing them, for example, on hilltops. They couldn't place them in the valleys where it's easier or scatter them, but no, they were piling them at strange places and always some very old ruins around. Why all that? Because these rivers of stones are actually shredded, torn to pieces, rock cut dwellings, castles, cities, whatever. At places we saw that it seems this was caused by weapons, but at other locations it could have been simply earthquakes. A solid hill is less likely to turn into such a river of stone than a hollow one, because practically that's what they are. These underground dwellings, entire hills and mountains, practically made hollow inside. And practically what remains for us to see usually are just the outlinings of the last rooms that were located on the edges of such dwellings. I absolutely agree that the ruins of some of these rooms, taken out of context, could be called a geological formation. But is it really smart and even honest to take things out of context? This city continued for kilometers, and as we got further from the center, the type of rocks remained absolutely the same, but there were no ruins of rooms. So once again, this is not some peculiar way the local rocks erode, because the same rocks and the same conditions don't do it just a few kilometers away. There were some very elegant steps at Bobastro. The repair on them isn't that elegant because it's modern. And just for a comparison, this is how our work looks like. This is again at Bobastro, done for the tourists' modern construction. But the historic steps didn't look like they were part of rooms, they look like an outside stairway. So, were the Bobastro ruins also actually rock cut castles and not completely underground, something like the Egil castles of Turkey from the last video? Also, they could be from another civilization which found the ruins and used them for pilgrimage or tourism, who knows? But if the steps were done also by another culture, then they must have been also proficient in elegant rock cutting like the original builders. But despite the elegant lines of the design, very misleading type of illustrations and sometimes even groups of statues are placed at such sites all over the world, in Spain, in Turkey, everywhere. They select especially more eroded places so it won't look so much inconsistent, to create such false impression that our forefathers were only like this, bluntly ignoring the fact that significant engineering knowledge is required for building such multi-storied rock-cut dwellings, and in some cases big cities, is not a children's play as they make it look like with the statues of primitive people. First of all, we have a consistent thickness of the walls everywhere, which happens to be a challenging task even for the modern engineers who often fail in it. I'm not a rock cutting specialist, but I have heard that if we were to make such rock cut dwellings nowadays, we will be facing multiple failures. The floors or walls would be having many holes in them, just because it's hard to measure how thick is the wall as one digs on its both sides. Did you also notice the grid on the floor? So was it inlaid with something? Maybe a mosaic was cast in it, or it was a frame on which wooden floor was attached? We never know. It's absolutely amazing how little do we know about the history of our own planet, what kind of people lived here, what kind of art did they have. Or maybe the marks that we see on the floor are simply scoop marks from the tool that was used to dig all this. We never know. After all, very similar marks are found in the Andes of South America, on the famous unfinished obelisk in Aswan, Egypt, and near the village of Malyshevo in Russia. But the most tangible proof that these stone dwellings and entire rock-cut complexes are not the work of some Stone Age savages is their association with vehicle tracks, roads that show signs of technology that we can't even understand. The relation between the vehicle tracks and the rock-cut dwellings is clearly visible at many sites in Turkey, Greece, Italy, and Spain. Even the dog figured out that this is not a track of a cart route. It wasn't that difficult because it's got only one track, but it's still difficult for the penguins with the iron suits. When a man decides to shift his focus from iron suits and envying his neighbor to inquiring into the nature of reality and one's actual origin, then he'll discover really amazing stuff. During the Spain expedition, I started doubting that, as if some sort of machine was digging the rock as it goes. These images from Italy are only confirming my suspicion. And by the way, these European and Asian rock-cut tunnels very strongly resemble the so-called mystery rock-cut tunnels and labyrinths of South America. They are all around Cusco and many other locations. But let's get back to Spain. In the first episode, we saw that the vehicle tracks were along with such rock-cut dwellings outside the city of Bocairent. But not only outside the Spanish city of Jumilla, we have a very similar situation. A dozen of the vehicles have been traversing this surface when it was soft, probably muddy, and left their imprints crossing and overlapping each other. And as usual, no trace of footprint or hoofprint. And again, as usual, remains of some sort of intelligent cuttings in the rocks around, and heavily eroded chambers or rooms, dwellings, we don't even know what are they. And again, as usual, heavily eroded remains of such chambers are seen in the nearby area of a diameter of a couple of kilometers, let's say. And I never stop wondering if the vehicle tracks were left in a soft mud that petrified over time. Were these also mud houses? Well, they shouldn't have been because they were multi-storied. And mud sounds like too flimsy to maintain such multi-storied dwellings, but we never know what can get petrified actually. And actually, before starting to understand what was going on here, first of all, we should get rid of our prejudices that living in a mud house or a straw house or simple-looking stone-cut dwelling is only for primitive people. It is not so. One can have technology at disposal and be a nature lover at the same time. Here somebody converted one of these ancient dwellings into something very sweet. And by the way, living in a stone-cut dwelling is a very hot and relevant topic nowadays, or at least it is so for the wise, considering the terrible pollution of malevolent wavelengths that one is exposed just by being out in the open. More details on that in my vibroacoustics video. But certainly the most interesting sight, which showed combined both strange vehicle tracks and rock-cut dwellings, was the castle of Mecca. Most of the ruins consisted merely of hints that yes, there has been something here once upon a time. Maybe this was a hole? It's not so small. And then there were so many rectangular cuttings in the rock, starting from a very small, reaching to a proper size swimming pools. Some of them had rows of cuttings on the side, same type of cuttings that we would see on the side of the road. I'm not absolutely convinced that these were necessarily water reservoirs, as most people tend to think automatically. The same cuttings are also found in great numbers in Turkey at similar sites, and when they actually excavated and cleaned up few of them, it turned out that they are actually staircases to lower floors, lower stories. And this could very well be the case at Mecca as well, because there were steps at a number of these pools. Moreover, very often trees grow in them. If they were full of water, the roots of the trees would simply rot. And it's not that our expedition happened to be in some sort of dry season. On the contrary, out of all cuttings, there was one that had water in it from the recent rains, and it happened to be a very small one of the smallest actually. So it is extremely unlikely that these were actually water reservoirs. We don't know even what they were. And since the vehicle tracks were left in the soft mud, then we don't even know if what now looks like a rock cut remains of architecture and buildings that could have been made of some other material that later on got petrified. Such cuttings are abundant at the other sites belonging to this civilization or culture like Turkey, and the geologist Alexander Koltepin studied them, this type of cuttings over there, and he thinks that they are nothing else but petrified earthworks. Same as in Mecca, we see steps going inside the rectangular cuttings. So when geologists discuss petrification, they always talk as if that takes thousands and millions of years or really long time, but in reality they are objects that are attributed, let's say, to dynastic Egypt, which is another very misleading label, but objects belonging to that era are found petrified. So even though the label is not very correct, still loosely it means something that happened within the last few thousand years. So what I'm getting at is petrification is quite a common thing, and there would be nothing unusual if all these stone cut things are actually something else that got transformed. This is another example, one out of the many. And getting back to Mecca, there were megaliths too. Probably there was a wall that was still visible at a couple of places. The stonework was rather precise, which is typical for the older megaliths, but yet now it is very hard to say, does this belong to the original site or it was an addition by the cultures who used it afterwards? Because there were definitely signs of secondary use of the site. These are two examples. This one and this one, barely any explanation is needed. The style is so different, and the technique and the extent to which it has fallen apart in due time. But also one thing made me wonder when and how the megaliths got destroyed, because the megalithic blocks were scattered even some few hundred meters away from where the wall was. If this was an earthquake, it must have been a really monstrous one, or it could have been also a weapon. That would explain why the majority of blocks are simply gone missing. The missing ones certainly did not evaporate by the means of erosion, because we see pretty sharp angles on some of the remaining ones. Yet another sign that the megaliths could be subsequent addition. So Mecca was our first site from the category of elf castles, and the second one was Esperija, near the town of Espera. Obviously, it is not as well preserved as other sites of this category that I've been showing you from Turkey, but the main thing here is that we can confirm that the sites of the same category, of the same style, are present in many countries and separated by seas and continents. This is the most important I could learn from this site so far, but also there were at least surely one megalithic block rolled down the hill, because this is on a hill. It's let's say 100 or 200 meters long complex, and there were other rocks in the fields, also probably megalithic. It requires more research. I simply didn't have enough time to spend over there. This was actually the best preserved room. We can get some clue about the door. It was rotating or something like this. Clearly, the oval shape is visible at the threshold. And then this is what you see as you stand on the ruins of Esperija. And since we know from Turkey that usually the elf castles go in groups, we saw a couple of other hills and decided that there could be ruins there as well. We managed to visit the nearest of them, and as I opened the door of the car on the parking lot, this is what I saw immediately. Actually, there was a medieval fort on that hilltop built on the ruins of an elf castle. On all sides of the hill, one could see remains of chambers or stairways. I want to return again to this spot to Espera because a lot remained unexplored. And now the most puzzling sight out of all. Sierra de San Cristobal, and although it is a couple of square kilometers of rock cuttings like this everywhere, this could be only the tip of the iceberg because ruins of this style are found at least in a radius of 10 kilometers around. And tip of the iceberg in a vertical sense maybe as well. There were just deep shafts, at least some 20-30 meters deep. Actually, entire stories or floors of it seem to have been simply buried by time. And yes, there were some rather large internal galleries, but when you try to get to their end, if it wasn't clogged by the land masses and the sand, then they would be blocked by modern walls. It seems in the past this was much more freely accessible. Nowadays, one requires special permission to enter. There are armed guards and they don't let people enter on the pretext that this is a private property. That's what they say, although this is some sort of abandoned military zone. And actually, this so-called nature walk called Sierra de San Cristobal is the only one that somehow or other one can maybe visit. The other places, apparently they were opened before, but now when we tried to visit, the roads were closed with signs private property. Did they sell the historic, what they call necropolis? Did they just sell it to private people recently? There was no sign of agriculture. I don't think it was private. And there were few other locations in this area with the similar ruins. We had photos of them. We were asking the locals, and always they were already closed down, or some of them were with metal bars, or some other reason, but always the result was they were inaccessible. But anyhow, the main question remains, what is this? I agree that most parts of it do resemble a quarry. Yet at other places, these were most definitely walls. Just look at them. And not just any walls, these are few stories high for our standards. If these are the walls of halls, this would be really, Olympic size concert halls, huge. And most likely these are the walls of chambers and not just the fencing gardens, because don't forget that the current earth level has nothing to do with the original earth level. And actually saying quarry is wrong. I got misled by the official label. No, it doesn't look like quarry, it looks like mine. It looks like somebody was mining for something specific. That's why they were making those deep, deep shafts. It was difficult to take photos of them. Their edges were not secured. And that's why there are many underground levels here. If one was looking just for stone, one would take everything, all the stone, as one can get hold of it, and not selectively dig underground tunnels as if searching for something. So, okay, we can say that partially this looks like large scale mining. Plus, the walls of unknown buildings, probably besides it, were they living here while they were mining nearby? And add to all these few segments that looked exactly like a typical Deronkuyu style underground city, underground chambers. Here is one such room. There weren't many, but there were some. It looks as if somebody has been even living here recently. This is definitely a historic dwelling, and it is within the complex of this mining operation. Does it predate it? Is it there just by chance? Is it somehow connected? It's extremely puzzling. And then again, the problem that we always face at similar sites is where is all the stone that has been taken out, that has been quarried or mined. Even if we assume that this was purely a quarry or a mine, still there should have been lots of leftovers. Even if you quarry stone for the purpose of building, still not all of it is fit. There would be a lot of garbage. I did not see any of that around. I always think that all these sites are extremely old, and that's why the stone was carried away by the numerous historic floods over the thousands of years. But since all of this is extremely weird, then who knows, maybe somebody just took all the stone off-site, like off-planet? Certainly, Sierra San Cristobal places many unanswered questions. I don't have an answer, but the closest I have could be this site from Israel. The outside style of this site in Israel resembles closely the outside looks of the mines of Sierra San Cristobal, but with touch of the so-called elf castles style. Rectangular cuttings of this style with absolutely same border are abundant on the elf castles, especially at those of Spain and Italy. Yet one more proof that we are talking about a culture that was spreading over continents. And on the top of all this, the inside of all these chambers looks like the Derankuyu style underground cities. And as if all this cocktail was not enough, we get at the very same site also the vehicle tracks. Those same mysterious for us vehicles that were moving right next to the wall, same like Spain and Italy. See, the track is at the very edge of the rock cut road, and not just any rock cut road, cut deep into the bedrock. Absolutely same as in Spain, Italy, and even Germany. That by itself is a titanic work to cut passages in a solid bedrock. Moreover, a situation where it is not required. If it was some sort of small tunnel to make it easier to cross a mountain, then I would understand. But I saw it at locations where it wasn't actually required by the landscape. So having all these features and style at one place maybe is here to show us that actually this was happening at the same time. Maybe they belonged to the same civilization. We just don't know because everything is so eroded and because so little has been done studying it. After all, Alexander Kotepin told me that they basically all belong to the same geological time, whenever that was. So maybe Sierra de San Cristobal was simply a mining operation of the people who were building these things. And yet, another parallel between Sierra de San Cristobal in Spain and the incredibly rich ancient underground worlds in Israel are the bell-shaped caves. Although the ancient grottos of Israel are way bigger and way more spectacular in comparison to their smaller brothers in Spain, still the style is absolutely identical. Or maybe I simply did not get to see the big ones in Spain because of the extremely limited access. This is a photograph from the one I got to visit. It was, I don't know, maybe 7 to 10 meters high, and as you notice, very, very dark. And by the way, there were real proper historic quarries near Bucairent and near Sulana de Pedrera, but they clearly belong to a much more recent period, which was evident by their degree of erosion. They were relatively small, like this would be one complete quarry, and they looked like that they have been used to get stone for those recent repairs and additions. Just for a comparison, this is the quarry near Jumila, and this is a chamber from the older site, clearly much more eroded. Well, I visited a very small portion of the interesting, extremely ancient sites in Spain, but even from that, I can definitely say that this region was very densely populated in extreme antiquity, maintaining a population of many millions, probably. And I hope to return, especially to northern Spain in the near future. Just an example, what can be seen there, like these canals. Of course, they are officially labeled as being Roman. Of course, they use graphic depiction to manipulate the flexible consciousness of the students and tourists who happen to visit. And the common workers supposedly building the canal are of course depicted as some sort of idiots beating each other, or something of that sort. It doesn't matter really as long as it distracts the public attention from the actual ruins. 600 kilometers are now only preserved, God knows how much was it originally, of rock cut supposedly canals, but I don't see how is this different from the rock cut roads that we saw all over southern Europe and even the Middle East. And this is an absolutely titanic amount of work. And on this particular photograph, the upper line, it makes me think it's very similar. It kind of, the height at which it has been cut and the full style of everything looks like those machine-like cut roads that we saw earlier in this video. And it is 600 kilometers in this region alone preserved. And all this is in a picturesque area where at every step one wonders, are these strange natural rocks or are these ruins of extremely old castles?